I'm Vamp, and this is a guide for playing Holy Paladin in more of a hybrid damage role in Mythic Plus content, more commonly known as a Shockadin. I will try to cover most of the essential information needed to be successful no matter the difficulty, and also share some tips and advice from personal experience. With the introduction of Legion, the DPS potential of all of the healing classes in general has become incredibly relevant, where in previous expansions there felt like there was very little more to do than sit back, keep everyone alive and get your job done. There is now more than enough reason to want to get into the thick of it and get your damage shoes on, and with Holy Paladin in particular, with the right knowledge you can be turned into an absolute damage powerhouse. So for Mythic Plus content then, sure, we're initially there as the healer and that's not going to change, but now we have this new strong potential to bring a relevant amount of damage at the same time, effectively turning us into a hybrid. With the appropriate talents, gear and knowledge, we can bring the burst of an actual DPS whilst also keeping the group alive, so let's get into it. Starting off with the bread and butter of any spec, we'll want to have the appropriate talents for the goal we're trying to achieve, and in this case we're looking to have relevant on-demand burst DPS. So with that in mind, tiers 1, 5 and 6 are the ones to look at in terms of improving that DPS, but we'll have a look at all of them to get a good understanding of how we'll operate in general in 5-man content. For tier 1, Crusader's Might is an absolute must. Considering Holy Shock is our highest damaging ability, which we'll cover later on, we'll be looking to cast as many of these Holy Shocks as possible, and this talent allows just that. Tier 2 is usually a split for me between Cavalier and Unbreakable Spirit, depending on the difficulty of the dungeon and the affixes for the current week. Cavalier is fantastic if more mobility is required, for example the intermission phase of Advisor Vandross, the final boss in Archway, as you can often fall behind the group if you're needed to stop to heal. Whereas Unbreakable Spirit is much more useful in higher difficulties, where you can really benefit more from that regular damage reduction from Divine Protection and Shield, and to also have that lay on hands ready a little more often. Why no Rule of Law, you may ask? And while it is an incredibly potent talent in both raid and larger group content, I even feel it's one of the best talents or abilities that we received in Legion in general. But when it comes to 5-man content, its uses are incredibly limited, as you will spend a good majority of your time closer to your 4 party members than you would to a 20-man raid spread throughout an entire room, for example. Tier 3, again, is very dependent on the dungeon and also our group's composition. Assuming damage is on our minds, even during trash packs, Fist of Justice will allow us to have our Hammer of Justice ready incredibly often, and this can be important as our interrupt was taken from us with Legion, so one of our only ways of helping out with interrupting is unstunnable enemies with Hammer of Justice. Repentance I've found to have limited use in general, but it can be used to help skip trash packs that have one enemy in particular getting in the way of your group. So for example, DHT and Archway come to mind. Blinding Light has some great uses in general, be that as an AoE interrupt for those pesky healers on the deck of the Naglfar in more assaults, or with some group discipline you can also use it to give your tank a little breathing space, be that because of high damage intake or to help them remove necrotic stacks. Tier 4 is our auras, and in my opinion there's only one real option here, with that being Devotion Aura. If you're able to keep relatively close to your tank, you have the potential to be giving him a passive 10% damage reduction, which you can also spread to a 20% reduction on the entire group with Aura Mastery, making it very potent for bosses such as Shade of Xavius, where he drops that huge AoE at 50%. I've also toyed with using Aura of Sacrifice for times where I feel I really need that extra AoE steroid for fights such as Wrath of Ashara or Advisor Melandris, though Devotion Aura is also incredibly useful in those same situations. Moving on to the core of our burst DPS with the next 2 tiers, tier 5 is an easy choice with Holy Avenger. Not only is it a fantastic cooldown to help us heal through those moments of high damage, but more importantly for this guide, it helps with our burst DPS, so a talent that helps both with healing and DPS, what's not to love? Like with tier 5, tier 6 is once again an easy lock with Sanctified Wrath, as we're not only getting more potent burst on our healing when it's needed, but it is ridiculous for helping with our burst DPS with that cooldown reduction on Holy Shock. Tier 7 is our beacons, and there's a little wiggle room here, which in my opinion depends purely on your own preference. If you mostly only participate in raid or larger group content, then Beacon of Virtue has probably fallen off your radar, but for 5-man content it is absolutely perfect as it adds to what our kit lacks most, consistent AoE healing. With most of our heals being tunneled into the tank in a huge number of situations, the benefit from single beacon is relatively small as you'll be healing that target anyway, right? So with Virtue you can be tunneling the tank, and then when the group needs some attention you pop it and you can heal everyone up. It is important to note, if you're not familiar with this beacon, you can cast a heal such as Flash of Light, and if you activate the beacon as the heal lands, then that heal will benefit from the beacon as well, effectively giving you an extra GCD within the beacon window. I will also talk about Beacon the Lightbringer here, as I feel it is also a viable choice if you so desire. It may mean you need to put a little extra effort into the group during high damage intake, but it allows you to be a little lazier in general with healing. Not that I'm suggesting this train of thought, but let's be honest, some of us enjoy sitting back. I should also note that this is definitely my preferred beacon of choice when the overflow affix is in place, as we have no real control over who will receive the virtue beacons, so it's much more consistent in general to manually heal and avoid those nasty absorbs. Moving on to our Shockadin rotation, for when your group is looking like they don't need healing, you're going to want to be railing into those bad guys. Shockadin DPS is an incredibly simple priority rotation which follows. Judgment is your number 1 priority, followed by Holy Shock, then Crusader Strike, and Consecration coming up last. Now I've been going on about how Holy Shock is our highest damaging ability, yet Judgment takes the number 1 spot on the priority list, and that is because of the debuff it applies to enemies that causes them to take 30% increased damage from both Holy Shock and Crusader Strike for 6 seconds. It should be pretty obvious why this debuff is important to our DPS. I mean, who doesn't want the 2 spells we cast the most whilst DPS and to hit harder, right? What's also important to note, that with the added haste we pick up from the Holy Avenger talent and cooldown reduction from Sanctified Wrath and Crusader's Might, we will be able to squeeze in 3 Holy Shocks within this Judgment window, making for some nasty burst. With Judgment out of the way, we'll be looking to cast as many Holy Shocks as possible, and this is where you'll start to feel the rotation weave as you alternate between Holy Shock and Crusader Strike when haste allows it. This could be via Holy Avenger, Bloodless Terrorism, or if you have a nasty gear set purely for this purpose. Consecration is tagged onto the end as it's our only other damaging ability that we have, and while our rotation will feel busy with high amounts of haste, there will be a ton of holes in it when we don't, and Consecration is slipped in during those moments that everything else is on cooldown. It's also important to note that it's our only AoE source of damage, so dropping it on trash pools in between healing can be very useful. With that rotation fresh in our minds, let's have a look at it in action. Moving on to stat priority, as with raids or just about any content for Holy Paladin, we'll be wanting a solid amount of crit. Now you can use Dreamguard's spreadsheet to be able to calculate your stat weights relative to your own gear if you really want to min-max, but in general you want to focus on crit with any amount up to 50% being relevant for both healing and DPS. Then we're going to look at Mastery and Versatility for healing. While they're incredibly close to each other, stat weight wise, and it's mostly a playstyle preference as to which stat you want to lean on, I'm more a fan of Mastery in general, and for dungeons in particular it's easy to stay within your Mastery range of most of your group a lot of the time, making it highly effective. That leaves us with Haste, which is kind of the problem child here. For raid content we're obviously trying to stay away from it due to the mana burn, but for dungeon content it's incredibly useful as it's the next best stat after crit for improving our DPS. And to be fair, it's also great for healing 5-man content as well, as there are plenty of opportunities to drink in comparison to being in constant combat in a raid scenario, so there's no need to worry about that mana burn. The reason that crit is so desirable for both DPS and healing is that Holy Shock, again our highest damaging spell, benefits from double our crit chance, so reaching 50% crit chance guarantees the crit on Holy Shock. Though bear in mind that during Wings we do receive an extra 20% crit chance, which Holy Shock will take double from again, so in terms of our burst potential you don't need to worry about rocking that 50% crit chance to guarantee Holy Shock hitting like a train. On the topic of stats, we'll also consider relics, trinkets and legendaries. Fortunately for us, the Shock Treatment relic that is our best in slot for healing is also going to be our best in slot for DPS, so if you've had decent luck picking them up so far, then your Holy Shocks will be destructive. Trinket wise, while I've not had the chance to try out many in general, as it's difficult to grab them off of DPS and in general we can't set a loot specialization for caster trinkets, I have managed to get my hands on a few. My thoughts so far have been that in dungeons, we can easily set our burst DPS up for bosses in particular, so having trinkets synergize with this on-demand burst will give us the best output. With that in mind, my main trinket of choice has been the Wriggling Sinew from Il'gynoth in Emerald Nightmare. It comes with passive crit, which is already fantastic, and more importantly it has a damage and burst as an on use, meaning I can always couple it with my cooldowns as my group engages a boss. The damage can also crit, which is great as we run with so much of it, and it also scales with any modifiers we may have. Basically, feel free to toy with any trinkets that you come across, and even suggest any that you found to be particularly potent in the comments below, as I'll be interested to know what else works well. Any sort of instant damage trinket, such as, I don't know, the Gnarled Root or Shock Baton, anything along those lines will work fantastically well with our burst. Having only mentioned DPS trinkets so far though, if at any point you're not feeling comfortable with keeping your group alive, this will likely be the case once you break into plus 10 and onwards, then I definitely advise running with healing trinkets. A little less burst on your damage for that extra cushion of healing is more than fine. As far as legendaries are concerned, there's only really one that has a real impact on our DPS, and that's Chain of Frayne. Though it has been nerfed since it's had its rework, it still provides that 10% damage increase. Cephas can also be a consideration, as there's usually a decent amount of dispellable debuffs or enemies susceptible to crowd control in 5 minutes. Finally, we'll look at the affixes that concern us as healers in Mythic Plus content. Sanguine and Volcanic don't really concern us, so pushing those aside, we've got Bolstering, which we always want to keep a keen eye on in terms of how a pack of enemies is being DPS'd so we're not taken by surprise at any extra damage, and always have Hammer of Justice ready in case a particular enemy ends up getting bolstered into oblivion, as it can happen quite often. Next up we have Necrotic. Always have a way of monitoring how many stacks your tank is receiving of this, and bear in mind that each stack is 3% reduced healing, so let's say your tank is approaching 30 plus stacks, then your heals are going to do next to nothing, so you may as well pull out that hammer and help out the remaining enemies to ease the pressure on the tank. Or like I mentioned earlier, if you're running Blinding Light, then communicate that with your tank and try to use it effectively. Overflowing is a big one for us, and while this affix may not even exist for some healing classes, for us in particular it can be very nasty if it takes us off guard, and as our gear gets better, oh boy does this affix get worse. To begin with, we always want to be wary in general of Holy Shock. We already know the spell heals for a nasty amount, especially when it's a guaranteed crit, so make sure it's only used as an emergency heal, or what I do like to do is use it mostly on enemies for damage and then use the infusion of light procs from the Holy Shock crit to do the actual healing. We also really want to keep a keen eye on Power of the Silver Hand, which is the artifact buff from one of the Golden Dragons. This turns our Holy Shocks basically into lay on hands or even stronger. And it's important to note that we can't actually cancel this buff, so always be aware whenever it procs, just to really minimise your healing output during it, or, as that can sometimes not be a possibility as your groups get decked, just be extremely careful of who you choose to put the Holy Shock onto, as there's a good chance, if it's a big one, you're gonna get a pretty nasty overshield from it. Raging, not a huge concern in general, but depending on the dungeon that we're in, this can end up causing a few issues. One in particular that comes to mind are the Pelters and Shapers in Neltharion's Lair, who can turn into bosses on their own when they enrage, and for some reason the groups I'm always in, always like to leave them on 10% before finishing them off, which can result in some pretty frantic healing. Skittish, probably obvious, but always be ready to throw out emergency heals or blessings on your DPS, especially the melee, as they will undoubtedly grab aggro every now and again. And last but not least we have Teaming. Again, not a huge concern, but going back to Nel's Lair, extra Pelters can be very scary on higher difficulties. Or maybe I just really hate Pelters, I don't know. And that just about covers the general approach to a Mythic Plus dungeon from a Holy Paladin's point of view. I've mostly talked through this guide with the assumption that you have a general idea of the Holy Paladin's kit and how to heal with them, so I can focus on the aspects that you wouldn't really normally be used to. Though having said that, we do also have some real nice niches on some raid encounters where our damage that we've been using in these Mythic Pluses is also very useful there. If there's anything that I've missed or anything in general that you'd like to know, then feel free to drop a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. If you've liked this video, then please spread it to whoever you feel would also want to watch it. Exposure in any form for me would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if there's a particular topic you'd like for another video, then let me know. Anything from, I don't know, the healing side for the Holy Paladin, or how to handle specific raid or dungeon encounters. Pretty much anything, just stick it in the comments below and I'll get back to you. And thanks again guys, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. I don't need the exact dungeon anyway, I just need to clip so it's okay. we're making a Mythic Plus guide of how to fall through fucking fuck.